Thank you. Well, good afternoon. I wanted to follow up on our report from the pre-electoral mission and speak a little to the current state of politics in Canada and the debate around the Canada-Colombia Free Trade Agreement. 2 weeks ago, as we know, Liberal trade critic Scott Bryson announced an amendment to the FTA, which has been touted as a step forward for human rights in Colombia and in Canada. And this amendment would have Canada and Colombia annually participate in a human rights assessment. In Canada, the Trade Committee would reportedly call on human rights groups to testify. Now, while the way that the amendment has been structured, each country speaks to their own human rights record and their own does their own assessment of human rights in their own countries, and that then goes into a process of evaluating the ongoing free trade agreement. I think it's important to look at the process to date around the debate of the Canada-Colombia Free Trade Agreement, and certainly the direction or the outcomes of recommendations by similar parliamentary committees. To date, there have been numerous testimonies, first-hand accounts, and experiences which have been relayed to the Canadian Standing Committee on Trade regarding the Canada-Colombia Free Trade Agreement. The committee very clearly made a recommendation to the government which has been ignored, and this is to undertake and respond to an independent human rights impact assessment before debate goes further or continues around the Canada-Colombia Free Trade Agreement. With the introduction of the amendment that Bryson put forward, the recommendations from this committee have not only been ignored, they've been practically thrown aside. So for the public, for the Canadian public who have grave concerns around this free trade agreement, how can this amendment in any way respond to those concerns when we've seen recommendations to date go summarily ignored by the government? So as we know, in addition, and picking up on pieces of the report, as we know that Bryson has publicly stated that he believes the Colombian government line that there are no more paramilitary groups in Colombia. But as we've heard, and as we heard on the ground in Colombia, this is completely untrue. Paramilitary violence continues, and we have to understand that, and we have to listen to that when we're deciding what kind of agreements and what countries we want to enter into these agreements with. In addition, the differences between what we heard on the ground, so people's experiences from the wide array of organizations and people and officials that Barbara outlined that we spoke to, the gulf between what we heard from people on the ground and the sort of governing party line was so vast and so wide that the Canadian government would be remiss and irresponsible to not take this into account and to not insist on the independent human rights impact assessment before going forward. The free trade agreement with Colombia will not support and create the changes that all of us want to see in Colombia. We've heard this from people on the ground. We've heard this from people who have analyzed free trade agreements in the past. And adding in this amendment which seeks to appease people's concerns around the lack of human rights and the lack of democracy in Colombia will simply not do this. The Bryson Amendment is a sham, and it's an embarrassment to trade policy. From what we know of the Colombian government's links to paramilitary groups, and certainly something we heard over and over again in our delegation on the ground in Colombia, the continued existence of congressional representatives and certainly the ruling government's links to paramilitary groups is something that we can't possibly expect the Colombian government on an annual basis to earnestly and with integrity report on. Finally, our call on the government and to members of Parliament of conscience has been and will continue to be that there should be no further debate on the Canada-Colombia Free Trade Agreement without the independent human rights impact assessment report. Thank you.